Alright, welcome back to the deep dive. We've had a ton of listener requests to do a deep dive on Hecate, and so, well, here we are, ready to plunge into the mysteries surrounding her. Yeah, Hecate, she's a fascinating figure really. In the scholarship on her, it's vast and complex, just like the goddess herself. We've got some classic work, some recent research, all sorts of perspectives to consider. We're going to try to cover, what? Where did she come from? 3 Russian Perion? Who knows? And then, how did she develop in those early Greek texts? Has he had that Homeric hymn to Demeter? Those are key. And of course, what does the archaeological evidence tell us? At least up to, say, the 5th century BC. Okay, so origins first. Where did Hecate come from? One of the big theories out there is this Thracian connection, and that's largely because of, well, the comparisons to another goddess, Bendis. Right, Bendis. But here's the tricky part. Almost everything we know about Bendis comes through, well, a Greek filter. We're talking Greek literature, inscriptions, sculptures. It's tough to get back to a truly Thracian Bendis, you know, and then see how she matches up or doesn't with Hecate. Well, like, what do we know about Bendis from those sources? Well, she had a pretty major cult in Athens, no doubt about that. The Bendia, first of all, big processions, votive offerings. She's also often paired with Artemis and Selene, that lunar connection. It pops up a lot. And then there's some scholars who link her to nymphs and this figure called Parthenos, which, you know, that could point to an agricultural or fertility aspect. Oh, and that headdress that Bendis sometimes has. Well, there are some visual echoes there in later depictions of Hecate. So, you know, it's all suggestive, but not like a smoking gun for a Thracian origin. Okay, so suggestive, but not definitive. What about evidence of Hecate and Thrace itself? Well, we do find traces of her. You've got personal names on coins from Adara, a Thracian city. Hecate's name pops up there. But you know, when you look at those early images, there isn't a really strong visual connection between, say, how the Greeks depicted Bendis and how they depicted Hecate in the early days. So she's there, but that clear direct link, visually at least, it's missing. Alright, so Thrace is a possibility, but we need to be careful with the evidence. What about other theories about her origins? Well, the next big one would be Caria in southwestern Anatolia, and the heart of that argument is the sanctuary at Lagina. It's a major sanctuary for Hecate that suggests a strong local connection right there, and there's this key procession. Some scholars think that that ritual might hold some clues about her origins or her local origins in that area. A key procession. What do we know about that ritual? The specifics of the ritual, how it played out in those early periods? Well, that's not super clear, but the fact that there was this major ritual focused on Hecate does point to a really deeply rooted local tradition. And then, you know, there's the fact that the Carians and the Ionian Greeks had a lot of cultural exchange going way back to the late Bronze Age, even that kind of interaction that could easily lead to the transmission and adaptation of deities. I say, didn't one of the poets mention something about her footwear, like a linguistic clue or something? Yes, you're thinking of Pindar. He calls her Hecate of the bronze sandals, or with Phoenician red feet. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because Caria, they were famous for their dye production. Purple dyes, red dyes. And you know that word Phoenician. It was often used to refer to people involved in that purple dye trade. So Pindar's description could be linking Hecate to that Carian craft. There's even one scholar who points out that madder, it's a plant that grows in inland Caria, was a source of red dye. So it's like that little detail, the color of her sandals, might connect to a whole region and its economy, like those little nuggets. They're amazing for understanding the past, and actually Homer, he even compares bloodied ivory to ivory that's been stained purple by Carian women. Wow, that's a pretty powerful connection. Now, you mentioned something earlier about a daemon of Leros. How does that fit into this whole Carian theory? Okay, so that's a more fragmentary piece. We have this honorary decree, partially preserved from Stratonicaea, aka near Lagina, and it mentions the introduction of the cult of daemon of Leros. Now, daemon, that word, it changed in meaning over time. In earlier periods, it didn't always have that specific sense of like a particular type of spirit. It could be more general, like a divine power. So some scholars have suggested a connection to Hecate, you know, given that it's near Lagina. But honestly, it's pretty speculative. We just don't have enough to say for sure if that daemon of Leros is actually Hecate. Okay, so that one's a bit of a dead end for now. What about the stuff they've dug up at Lagina itself? Any archaeological finds there that tell us about her early character? Well, funnily enough, later finds at Lagina include items related to clothing. and some scholars think that, that might connect to Hecate's later association with childbirth, and if you tie that back to her earlier role in Hesiod as Kuratrophos, like a nurturer of children, well, it's just a kind of a short analogy in that aspect of her character. And then the fact that there was a cult of a daemon at Lagina that's attested epigraphic that could also reflect Hesiodic influence, and so could the allusions to the theogony on the temple's friezes and the divine partnership between Hecate and Zeus that's depicted there in relation to Stratonicea. Yeah, it seems like Hesiod's ideas were kind of floating around in that region and influencing religious practices, right? Okay, so Carria with Lagina seems like a strong contender for her origins. What about those other theories? The Mycenaean connection, Mesopotamia, yeah, those have been tossed around, but most scholars agree that the evidence just isn't there. It's too thin to really hold up. The real debate is between Thrace and Carria. Okay, so we've tackled the where, now let's get into the what. Like, what kind of goddess was Hecate in early Greek literature? Hesiod's theogony. That's a good place to start. What does he tell us? Oh, Hesiod's depiction of her is really striking. She's in this unique position of power. Zeus gives her authority over, well, pretty much everything. Land, sea, sky, even the underworld. She's associated with prosperity, victory in war, childbirth, healthy children. I mean, the breadth of her influence is huge. No other deity besides Zeus gets that kind of treatment. It's almost like she's right at the center of the divine order. She sounds like a major, almost like a universal power, the way Hesiod describes her. You could say that, and it's actually led to a lot of debate about that whole hymn to Hecate section in the Theogony. Was it originally part of Hesiod's work? And if so, how do we interpret it? Some scholars think Hesiod was personally devoted to Hecate. Others say it's more of an artistic choice, that by showing how effective Hecate is, in all these areas, it emphasizes the whole nature of divine power. And then there's the idea that it's about her liminal status, her ability to move between realms, like she's on the threshold between worlds. That liminality thing, it becomes really important for understanding Hecate. Liminal being in between spaces. That's a term that comes up a lot with her, Hesiod, and it's interesting that Hesiod doesn't really give her those chthonic or nocturnal traits, the darkness and underworld stuff that she becomes associated with later on, right? In Hesiod, she's powerful, active in all sorts of spheres, but not specifically tied to darkness or the underworld. But then let's look at the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Her role there, it's a bit different. Yeah, in the hymn to Demeter, it's all about that one myth, the abduction of Persephone. Exactly. She becomes part of that story. She's the one who hears Persephone's screams when Hades takes her, and she's the one who tells Demeter what happened. And later she goes with Persephone when she comes back from the underworld. So she's like a guide to help her in this really pivotal myth. So that myth really solidified that connection between Hecate and Persephone. It seems to formalize her role as Persephone's attendant, her companion, and that becomes pretty standard later on. We also get that epithet, krokopeplos, that could mean with bright headband or veil. So maybe that's pointing to a more dignified image, even a matronly aspect, and it connects her to other goddesses like Ceres and Rhea, who also have that epithet and a veil that could suggest, mystery, hidden power, that sort of thing. Oh, for sure. There's also this whole debate about whether Hecate is connected to the moon in the hymn. The word selas, which means light or brightness, is used to describe her torch. So some scholars say, aha, lunar connection, but others argue that, Demeter has torches too, and Celas doesn't automatically equal moon. The first really clear evidence for Hecate as a moon goddess doesn't show up until much later, like the 1st century AD, so there's that hint of light. But whether it's a specifically lunar thing in the Homeric hymn, that's still up for debate. It's amazing how those little word choices can lead to so many different interpretations. Now, there's also a much darker theory about her role in the hymn, something about maiden sacrifice. Yeah, that's a more challenging interpretation. Some scholars, like Burkert, they suggest that Hecate's role in the hymn, specifically her connection to Persephone's journey between worlds, that it might be tied to, well, this strange rite of maiden sacrifice that maybe existed in some places. The idea is that the dying maiden, she becomes symbolically linked to Hecate. She represents this failed transition from virginity to womanhood, like a break in the natural order. And then, there's the Tritopatores, vengeful ghosts that were believed to come from these kinds of untimely deaths. So in that view, Hecate's presence in the hymn carries these echoes of tragic, unfulfilled lives, these disrupted transitions. That's definitely a darker side to her compared to that powerful universal goddess we see in Hesiod. It seems like her character was already getting more complex, more shadowy even. Let's shift gears now and talk about the archaeology. What does the physical evidence tell us about Hecate, at least up to the 5th century BC? Okay, so the archaeological record gives us some concrete stuff, but it's not always easy to interpret. One interesting find is this statuette from Attica, 6th century BC. It shows a seated veiled figure, and the inscription says it's Hecate, but the statuette itself doesn't have any really specific attributes. It's pretty general. Some scholars have pointed out that, there might be some influence from Near Eastern iconography, like you see seated goddesses in Near Eastern art, figures like Cybele, so it's an early depiction, but not very detailed. So an early image, but not a lot of clearly defined characteristics. What about vase paintings? Do we see Hecate there? We do. In the 5th century BC vase paintings, those are more securely identified. They actually have inscriptions that say Hecate, so we can confidently say that's her in scenes like the Anodos of Persephone when she comes back from the underworld, and in the mission of Triptolemus, who's associated with the Eleusinian mysteries. In those scenes, she's always a torchbearer, and she often looks pretty youthful. There are also some less certain appearances in scenes of the rape of Persephone and the Gigantomachy, that battle between the gods and giants. But the torches, that's a consistent image. Okay, so torch-bearing, youthful, that seems to be the recurring visual in the 5th century. What about evidence of her actual worship? Did they build temples for her, shrines, things like that? We do have inscriptions from Ephesus, 5th century BC, that suggest a form of worship that's similar to what was going on in mainland Greece, especially Attica. So her cult was spreading beyond those potential original homelands. Now those small shrines, the Hecateia, they get talked about a lot, but dating those pre-Hellenistic ones in Athens, that's been tough. Archaeologically, we have literary sources that mention them, but the ones that survive archaeologically are often from later periods. Right. And what about Aristophanes, the comic playwright? Right. Does his work give us any clues about how people thought about Hecate, how they worshipped her back then? Aristophanes, who's a keen observer of Athenian life and a funny guy. So yeah, he gives us some interesting glimpses, even if they are comedic. In his play Plutus, he talks about people leaving food at Crossroads for Hecate, but he kind of presents it cynically, like the poor folks who snatch up the offerings. Maybe he's highlighting poverty there rather than any actual generosity of the goddess. And in Lysistrata, there's this mention of apotropaic invocations, basically prayers to ward off evil at those household shrines. Civic attire for people went on trips, so she's got this protective role associated with those little shrines. And in Clouds, there's a reference to purification rituals at Crossroads, another liminal space. So Aristophanes gives us this sense of how Hecate was woven into everyday Athenian life, even if it's through a comedic lens. And Crossroads, those were definitely important for her worship. Yeah, definitely. Now, as we get into the later part of the 5th century BC, we start to see a stronger emphasis on those chthonic associations and a lot of syncretism, blending with other goddesses. Absolutely. One of the key figures in that development is Artemis. There's this fragment from Aeschylus, the playwright, 5th century BC, and he equates Hecate with Artemis. It's probably in a chthonic context, something to do with the myth of Iphigenia, so their characteristics are starting to overlap, especially in those darker, more liminal situations where the lines between different deities could get a little blurry. And what about Euripides? He's the one who really connects her with Enodia, right? Yeah, Euripides is huge here. In his play Medea, and in some fragments he calls Hecate Enodia. Enodia, that name literally means in the road, or of the ways. So that points to a role as a guardian of entrances, crossroads, those liminal spaces, which fits perfectly with how Hecate was becoming associated with Crossroads. Euripides also seems to connect both of them to women's transitions. Maybe it's those earlier chorotrophic functions, but now they're taking on a darker aspect, something to do with failed or dangerous transitions. And this is also where we see that connection to magic and the dead really start to grow. So Enodia seems like a really important link in understanding that shift. What can you tell us about her? Like, where was she worshipped? What was she all about? Enodia was mainly a Thessalian goddess, and the archaeological evidence from Thessaly shows her as a chthonic goddess, connected to cemeteries, to homes. There's even keys which might symbolize protection to urban centers. She's even got an epithet, Propylaea, though what that meant back then, who knows? Thresholds, that staff, and ancestral connections. That one's Patroia. People called on her to avert danger, and crucially, she was linked to those Aorai, the spirits of women who died too young, and to liminal spaces. So those strong connections to thresholds and vengeful spirits probably explain why she and Hecate started to merge. You know, they're both moving in those same circles. So the Thessalian connection through Enodia seems like that really contributed to Hecate's darker image. And Thessaly itself, it had a certain reputation in the ancient world, didn't it? It did. It was known for witchcraft and sorcery, though the earliest mention of that we have is from Aristophanes in the late 5th century BC. But some scholars think that that reputation might have been exaggerated or even politically motivated, like Thessaly was seen as menacing, siding with the Persians during the Persian Wars, and that could have led to some negative portrayals by other Greek city-states. So, you know, it's a reminder that how we perceive cultures, it's complicated. There's always a lot going on. Yeah, it's wild how even politics can play a role in how people see a goddess. Now, we also hear about Hecate's connection to the Eleusinian mysteries. Does that tie into this whole chthonic thing? Yeah, she does become associated with the Eleusinian mysteries, but we have to be careful not to, project those later chthonic associations back onto the earlier periods. The sources that tell us about her role in the Eleusinian mysteries, those are relatively late, generally not before the 4th century BCE. So it definitely adds to that chthonic image, but it doesn't necessarily explain those first steps in that direction back in the archaic and early classical periods. Okay. So let's wrap this up. What are the key takeaways from our deep dive into Hecate's origins and early development? Well, first off, her exact geographical origin, it's still a mystery. We've got Thrace, we've got Caria. Both have good arguments, but neither is a slam dunk. Second, her early character, the way Hesiod portrays her, it's multifaceted. She's super influential, she's got her hand in everything, and it seems like there are both Greek and Anatolian influences there. And lastly, we see this gradual but definite development of those chthonic and magical associations, probably helped along by syncretism with goddesses like Enodia, who was all about those liminal spaces and the spirits of the dead. It's a picture of a complex, ever-evolving goddess. Her mysterious nature seems like that was there from the beginning, shifting, adapting as she encountered different regions, different belief systems. Absolutely. And it makes you think, right? Like, how did these local cults, these broader cultural ideas, how did they all come together to shape the identities of other ancient deities? What does Hecate's story tell us about syncretism? About how those divine identities were constructed in the ancient world? That's a great question to end on. A real thought-provoking one. Thanks for taking us on this fascinating journey. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Keep exploring. Keep those questions coming. There's always more to discover about Hecate and the world of ancient religion.